Ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah, ooh, ah. Why do fools fall in love? Why do birds sing so gay? And love is my way to break of day. Why do they fall in love? Why does the rain fall from up above? Why do fools fall in love? Why do they fall in?
Hello, good beans, and welcome back to Midnight Requiem. Today we'll be talking about an American rock and roll rhythm and blues singer and songwriter, best known as the boy soprano and lead singer of the New York City-based early rock and roll doo-wop group, the Teenagers, Frankie Lymon. Lymon was born in Washington Heights, New York City on September 3rd, 1942, to Jeanette and Howard Lymon. Howard was a truck driver and Jeanette was a maid, but also sang in the gospel group, the Harlem Marys. Frankie and his brothers Louise and Huey sang with the Harlem Marys Juniors. The Lymon struggled to make ends meet, so Lymon began working as a grocery boy at age 10. At age 12 in 1954, Lymon heard a local doo-wop group known as the Coupe de Villes at a school talent show. He became friends with the lead singer Herman Santiago, and he eventually became a member of the group, now calling itself both Murneys and the Premiers. One day in 1955, a neighbor gave the Premiers several love letters that had been written to him by his girlfriend, hoping to give the boys inspiration to write their own songs. Merchant and Santiago adapted one of the letters into a song, Why Do Fools Fall in Love? The Premiers, now calling themselves the Teenagers, got their first shot at fame after impressing Richard Barrett, a singer with the Valentines. Barrett, in turn, got the group an audition with record producer George Goldner. On the day of the group's audition, the original lead singer Santiago was late. Lymon stepped up and told Goldner that he knew the part because he helped write the song. The disc jockeys always called them Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers. Goldner signed the group to G Records, and Why Do Fools Fall in Love became its first signed in January 1956. The single peaked at number 6 on Billboard Pop Singles chart and topped the Billboard R&B Singles charts for 5 weeks. 4 other top 10 R&B singles followed over the next year or so. I Want You to Be My Girl, I Promise to Remember You, Who Can Explain, The ABCs of Love, and I'm Not a Juvenile Delinquent. I Want You to Be My Girl gave the band its second pop hit, reaching number 13 on the national Billboard Hot 100 chart. Goody Goody, written by Maddie Metlick and Johnny McSir, and originally performed by Benny Goodman, was a number 20 pop hit but did not appear on the R&B chart. The Teenagers placed 2 other singles in the lower half of the pop chart with the release of I Want You to Be My Girl. The group's second single, The Teenagers, became Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers. However, the album that mostly compiled the singles released in 1956 came out under the older name The Teenagers, featuring Frankie Lymon. In early 1957, Lymon and the Teenagers broke up while on tour in Europe. During an engagement at the London Palladium, Goldner began pushing Lymon as a solo act, giving him solo spots in the show. Lymon began performing with backing from pre-recorded tapes. The group's last single, Goody Goody, backed with Creation of Love, initially retained the Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers credit, but they were actually solo recordings with backing by session singers. Lymon had officially departed from the group by September 1957, and an in-progress studio album called Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers at the London Palladium was instead issued as Lymon's solo release. As a solo artist, Lymon was not nearly as successful as he had been with the Teenagers. Beginning with his second solo release, My Girl, Lymon had moved to Roulette Records. On July 19, 1957, episode of Alan Freed's live ABC TV show, The Big Beat, Lymon began dancing with a white teenage girl while he was performing. His actions caused a scandal, particularly among Southern TV station owners, and The Big Beat was subsequently canceled. Lymon's slowly declining sales fell sharply in the early 1960s. His Heights charting solo hit was a cover of Bobby Day's Little Bitty Pretty One, which peaked at number 58 on the Hot 100 pop chart in 1960, and which had been recorded in 1957. Addicted to heroin since the age of 15, Lymon fell further into his habit, and his performing career went into decline. According to Lymon in an interview with Ebony magazine in 1967, he was first introduced to heroin when he was 15 by a woman twice his age in 1961. Roulette, now run by Morris Levi, ended their contract with Lymon, and he entered a drug rehabilitation program. After losing Lymon, the teenagers went through a string of replacement singers, the first of whom was Billy Lobrano. In 1960, Howard Kenny Bobo sang lead on Tonight's the Night. With the teenagers later that year, Johnny Houston sang lead on 2 songs. The teenagers who had been moved by Morris Levi to End Records was released from their contract in 1961. The teenagers briefly reunited with Lymon in 1965 without success. Over the next 4 years, Lymon struggled through short-lived deals with 20th Century Fox Records and Columbia Records. He began a relationship with Elizabeth Mickey Waters, who became his first wife in January 1964, and gave birth to his only child, Francine, who died 2 days after birth at Lenox Hill Hospital. Lymon's marriage to Waters was not legal because she was still married to her first husband at the time. After the marriage failed, he moved to Los Angeles in the 1960s, where he began a romantic relationship with Zola Taylor, a member of the Platers. Taylor claimed to have married Lymon in Mexico in 1965, although their relationship ended several months later, purportedly because of Lymon's drug habits. Lymon, however, had been known to say that their marriage was a publicity stunt, and Taylor could produce no legal documentation of their marriage. In Major Robinson's gossip column of June 6, 1966, Zola said that the whole thing was a joke, that she went along with him at the time. He appeared in Apollo as a part of Revu, adding an extended tap dance number. Lymon recorded several live performances, such as Melinda in 1959, but none rose on the charts. His final television performance was a Hollywood A Go-Go in 1965, where the then 22 or 23-year-old singer lip-synced to the recording of his 13-year-old self singing Why Do Fools Fall in Love. On June 21, 1966, he was arrested of heroin charge and was drafted into the United States Army in lieu of jail sentence. He reported to Fort Gordon, Georgia, near Augusta, Georgia, for training. While in the Augusta area, Lymon met and fell in love with Amiri Eagle, a school teacher at Hornsby Elementary in Augusta. The two were wed in June 1967, and Lymon repeatedly went AWOL to secure gigs at small southern clubs. He was dishonorably discharged from the Army, and Lymon moved into his wife's home and continued to perform sporadically, traveling to New York in 1968. Lymon was signed by manager Sam Bray to his Big Apple label, and the singer returned to recording. Roulette Records expressed interest in releasing Lymon to records in conjunction with Big Apple and scheduled a recording session for February 28. A major promotion had been arranged with CHO Associates, owned by radio personalities Frankie Crocker, Herb Hamlet, and Eddie O.J. Lymon stayed at his grandmother's house in Harlem, where he had grown up, celebrated his good fortune by taking heroin. He had remarried clean ever since entering the Army 2 years earlier. On February 27, 1968, Lymon was found dead of heroin overdose at the age of 25 on the floor of his grandmother's bathroom with a syringe by his side. Lymon was buried at St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Throgs Neck section of the Bronx, New York City, New York. I'm Sorry and Sea Breeze in the 2 songs Lymon had recorded for Big Apple before his death were released later in 1969. Lymon's trouble extended to others after his death. After Diana Ross returned Why Do Fools Fall in Love to the top 10 in 1981, a major controversy concerning Lymon's estate ensued. Zola Taylor, Elizabeth Waters, and Amiri Eagle each approached Morris Levi, the music connoisseur, who retained possessions of Lymon's copyrights and his royalties, claiming to be Lymon's rightful widow. Lymon had neglected to divorce any of them. The complex issue resulted in lawsuits and counter-lawsuits, and in 1986, the first of several court cases concerning the ownership of Lymon's estate began. Trying to determine who was indeed the lawful Mrs. Frankie Lymon was complicated, by more issues. Waters was already married when she married Lymon. She had separated from her first husband, but their divorce was finalized in 1965. After she had married Lymon, Taylor claimed to have married Lymon in Mexico in 1965, but could produce no acceptable evidence to their union. Lymon's marriage to Eagle, on the other hand, was properly documented as having taken place at Willow Grove Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia in 1967. However, the singer was still apparently twice married and never divorced when he married Eagle. The first decision was made in Waters' favor. Eagle appealed, and in 1989, the appellate division of the New York State Supreme Court reversed the original decision and awarded Lymon's estate to Eagle. However, the details of the case brought about another issue whether mobster Morris Levi was deserving of the songwriting co-credit on Why Do Fools Fall in Love. Although early single release of Why Do Fools Fall in Love credit Frankie Lymon, Herman Santiago, and Jimmy Merchant as co-writers, later releases and cover versions were attributed to Lymon and George Goldner. When Goldner sold his music companies to Morris Levi in 1959, Levi's name began appearing as co-writer of Why Do Fools Fall in Love. In place of Goldner's, Lymon was never paid his songwriting royalties. During his lifetime, one result of Amir Eagle's legal victory was that Lymon's estate would finally begin receiving monetary compensation from his hit song success in 1987. Herman Santiago and Jimmy Merchant, both by then poor, sued Morris Levi for their songwriting credits in December 1992, and the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York ruled that Santiago and Merchant were co-authors of Why Do Fools Fall in Love. However, in 1996, the ruling was reversed by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit on the basis of the statute of limitation. Copyright cases must be brought before a court within 3 years of the alleged civil violation. While Merchant and Santiago's lawsuit was not filed under 30 years later, authorship of Why Do Fools Fall in Love currently remain in the name of Frankie Lymon and Morris Levi. Although the period of success was brief, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers' strings of hits were highly influential on the rock and R&B performers who followed them. In 1993, Frankie and the Lymon and the Teenagers were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and into the Vocal Group Hall of Fame in 2000. Lymon's music and story were eventually reintroduced to a modern audience with Why Do Fools Fall in Love, a 1998 biographical film directed by Gregory Nava, also director of the Selena biopic. Why Do Fools Fall in Love tells a comedic fictionalized version of Lymon's story from the point of view of his three wives as they battle in court for the rights of his estate. The song Harlem Roulette by the Mountain Goats off in 2012's album Transcendental Youth contains references to Frankie Lymon to the song Sea Breeze, and to Roulette Records frontman John Darnielle has stated that the song is about the last night of Lymon's life. Lymon's high voice sound is said to be a direct predecessor of the girl group sound, and the list of performers who name him as an influence include Michael Jackson, Ronnie Spector, Diana Ross, the Chantleys, the Temptations, George Clinton, Smokey Robinson, Lean Berry, and the Beach Boys, and Billy Joel, among others. The performers most inspired by a derivative of Lymon and the Teenager style are the Jackson 5 and their lead singer and future superstar Michael Jackson. Motown founder Berry Gordy based much of the Jackson 5 sound on Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers recording, and the Teenagers are believed to be the original model for many of the other Motown groups he cultivated. Now remember, my good beans, be nice and caring to each other. Please like the video and subscribe. Thank you. Have a wonderful night.